Check your watches, smart or dumb. Not you, your watches. Check the clocks. It is a time to think. I don't want people thinking that I think they're dumb.
No.
Chris?
No. And in fact, if you're listening to this, you are probably one of the least dumb people around.
Maybe you're even listening to this and you are on the right side of the Dunning-Kruger effect. You know what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, Chris?
I know what the Dunder-Mifflin effect is, but
The Dunder-Mifflin effect makes you dumber. The Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially, I think Timothy Feig brought this up to me one day, the idea that the less you know, the more you over-evaluate your knowledge. So the less you know, the more you think you know, essentially. So if you are a musical novice, maybe you know a handful of chords, you probably think you know a decent bit about music.
Yeah, you can kill it, you bet.
But you get to someone who's a master composer, and they probably realize more of what they don't know than what they do. The same is true theologically, right?
Yep.
Oftentimes, young bucks, theologically, you find out one or two key things at the scriptures.
A couple arrows in the quiver, and you fire them away.
I know everything, but the more you read, the more you realize that other people know way more than you. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is, if you're a 3 out of 10 on the knowledge scale, you might be prone to rate yourself as a 7. But if you're a legit 7 on the knowledge scale, you might rate yourself as a 5.
Josh, I think you're a 10.
Hold on, what does the Dunning-Kruger effect say when you think? So if you're listening, you might actually know way more than you think because you're the type of person that says, hey, I need to know more.
Yeah.
Right?
That's humility.
Welcome to the Dunning-Kruger podcast, A Time to Think.
And in fact, NBC always told me that the more I knew, the better off I would be. So
can all imagine.
We're here to help
NBC
realize their dreams for you and me.
That sultry, smooth voice is Christopher Tillman. He pastors a church in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. You might also know him as a fantasy football extraordinaire and
I do have
lover
a very good winning percentage
of all things ice cream.
I looked it up today, and I will say this: that not the wise man boast in his wisdom, not the mighty man boast in his might,
but let the fantasy football players boast in their
I looked at it today because we've got our some guys in our church do a pretty involved fantasy league, and I looked, and we've done it for the past 6 years or so, and I have a 64% win percentage, and the highest point
I'm assuming that's good for fantasy football?
Yeah. I mean,
you always need to know what's good for, because 31% is great in baseball.
Well, the other
64% as an NFL quarterback is slightly below average.
Yes. The other teams kind of top out in the mid to high 50s. Like 57 was the next highest.
Now, is this just because that one time you took advantage of someone by stealing all their top players in a trade?
I did not do that.
No? That was a fair trade?
That was a fair trade.
Everyone in Stevens Point would vouch for that being a fair trade?
Hey, you know what?
Hey.
Anyways.
That's Christopher Tillman.
I love fantasy football. I love football. Please
Stevens
continue.
Point. I am Josh Holland, pastor of church in Wausau, Wisconsin.
Not Warsaw, Poland. Wausau, Wisconsin.
Wausau, yeah. I think I had to answer the Poland question a lot when I moved up here.
Interesting.
But not anymore. Little old Wausau. Whenever I meet someone, they say, "Where are you from?" I say, "I live in the place
Nassau,
where it says Wisconsin on the map. Smack dab in the middle."
Yeah, time is on your side here.
Yeah.
I have never understood what that means, but
it means that time's not on your side, I think. This is a time to think. We seek to have careful, thoughtful engagement with issues in the culture and the church. Try to talk about things that we don't have a ton of time for on a Sunday morning when we're just in the...
Like fantasy football.
Like fantasy football or Pride Month.
Pride
Month. Both ends of the spectrum, if you will. We just got out of a series, speaking of Pride Month, on some sexuality issues in the culture and how Christians should think about those types of things. And one of our last podcasts, we talked about language. So it's titled Language Games. We talked about the confusion of language, abstract language. And then we went to Romans 1, and we talked about clear language given to us in the scriptures. And we're going to kind of thread this through to a new series on relationships. And the link in the chain between those two things is going to be about marriage. So marriage is a key relationship in society. It's a key relationship in the church. If you're married, you could argue it is the key relationship in your life. There are many statistics about how you can have all things in the world outside the home. If the home's not going great, you're going to be dissatisfied in life. And if the home's going great, you can have very little outside the home and be quite satisfied because marriage is a defining relationship. It's also a defining term.
Ooh.
So as we think about Obergefell in 2015, as we think about the last few decades of political engagement and the sexual revolution, the word marriage has been a very important term.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our link in the chain here, Chris, is we're gonna define marriage because it's a term that needs to be defined. And
Really?
then we're going to talk
Are you
about...
sure it needs to be defined,
I'm
Josh?
so sure that we're going to do a podcast
yeah.
on it. And then we're going to talk about the relationship and the importance of it. So first off, Chris, give me maybe a helicopter view of how you've observed the term marriage changing over the past couple decades.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I mean, I grew up in a very nuclear family. I mean, we were as nuclear as the atomic bomb.
As
basically.
George Bush, nuclear.
Nuclear, yes, nuclear. So, I mean, I grew up with an extremely stable family, which I guess I thought everybody had that in many different ways growing up.
Okay, so you were able to take something for granted that you now see
100%.
not across the board.
100% take for granted. And, I mean, this is no offense because I know people who have been and whose parents have been divorced. But
You're on a podcast with one of them right now.
Yeah, yeah. And so I grew up in a family where if there was a classmate that I would want to go hang out with or something, my parents would be aware if their parents were divorced or not. I mean, it was that serious of an issue in our family that my mom and dad took the marital status of classmates' parents into consideration when it came to how we interacted. So, I grew up in a very much, we would say idyllic 1950s type of environment. My parents are both from small towns in Wisconsin, and that's what I grew up with. And so, took it for granted. My dad was a teacher, home during the summertime, spent time with us. We didn't do vacations. We spent time as a family, and that's something I've tried to replicate in my own home as a pastor. I mean, I work year-round. My dad worked, 9 months out of the year as a teacher, and spent other time prepping in the summer. But, generally it was time home with Dad. And my mom stayed home with us until we got to be school age, and then she would work part-time, but she'd always be there, right? So I grew up with that.
Parental presence is a very big thing for you.
Yeah, extremely. And so my impressions of marriage had always been related, generally speaking, to, I would say not even necessarily to the relationship between husband and wife, but to the relationship to the family unit as a whole.
Okay.
And so the family unit was an incredibly important part of how I perceived my parents to function. I didn't grow up with parents who did things like date nights or anything like that. It was just.
So if I can pause you, you're initially establishing that the marital unit is not necessarily a separate entity from the family unit.
Correct.
Those two intertwined.
Correct. And so, that was kind of how I grew up. And then as I observed, friends whose parents were divorced, I thought it a strange thing. But as time went by, it became a more and more normalized thing. And I grew up, largely my childhood was in the 90s. And that was a pretty, I would say, pivotal time period for how the culture related to the issue of marriage. Because in the 90s, divorce became a more normalized thing. And I think President Clinton, with his, dalliances, extramarital dalliances, in some respects normalized the idea of extramarital sexual relationships. And then getting into the 2000s, things subsided a little bit, but what was clearly on the horizon was the idea of marriage is not bound to a family unit. Marriage is not bound to a design. Marriage is bound to the personal satisfaction of two individuals, whether or not they are enjoying that relationship at the time. If they're not enjoying it, then they can cease that relationship through divorce. And eventually it became a relationship that would be experienced between two men, two women, whatever the case might be, for personal fulfillment, and completely divorced from an objective design. So you're kind of tracing, starting from your perspective on marriage to a cultural change in marriage.
Yeah. The key that I want to draw from both of those is that both of them has a definition. Mm-hmm. So before we even argue the merits of a definition, both what you observed in your childhood, which was marriage as essentially non-distinct from a family unit, mm-hmm. that a large part of what the marriage provides is
the beginning of
stability
family.
And presence for the family. So if you were going to define marriage and you made your parents sit down, they would probably come up with something like a union, which is for the benefit and good of a larger unit.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes presence and sacrifice and generosity and service, those types of things. Whereas then we get to the 2000s, and marriage would then, like you said, greater be defined by a union whose chief objective is personal fulfillment.
Yep.
Now, those two things are very different because one of them is inward looking and one of them is outward looking.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I beg this question about the definition of marriage is because I think I've said on this podcast before that I wasn't one to really quibble with whether or not you call two men who have a wedding a married couple. Mm-hmm. Back in 2015 to 2017, 2018, that was me just out of college. Maybe that was part of it, as I didn't quibble too much because I was relatively young. Sure. I hadn't seen many of the effects of ideologies, those types of things. Yeah. But I was like, I disagree with it biblically, but I'm fine to call it marriage. What I didn't see at the time is that terms matter. Yeah. And so the definitions of terms matter because if you call something a marriage, you legitimize something or you equate it with another type of thing. Yep. I think this conversation, to open a whole nother can of worms, one of the reasons I bring it up is because on the previous podcast I said that I have largely in my personal time stopped using the term like transgender man. Yep. Because I think it's a confusion of language. Correct. And it takes a lot longer to say someone who is a female but considers themselves to be a male. It takes a lot longer to say that, but it's way more clear definitionally. Yeah. And I personally was just getting confused where I was going, wait, what is it? What is a trans man or what is a trans woman? Is that right? And I that's why we did the podcast on language games, because that's the point of the language, is to confuse. Yep. And I think there's a similar analogy there with marriage is if we can call two men or two women getting some sort of partnership, if we call that a marriage, we can confuse what a marriage actually is. Mm-hmm. And so I want to give a biblical definition for marriage to kind of push back against that. So
sounds like a good idea.
So if a Christian was ever to say, hey, that's not okay to two men or two women get married, it's not okay biblically, and someone was able to say, why can't two people who love each other get married? The Christian would be able to stop, pause, think, and say, because there's actually a definition of what marriage is. Mm-hmm. And two men or two women doing that does not fulfill the definition, and therefore cannot be defined as the word. Yeah. So I'm going to give a definition for what I think marriage is biblically, and I want you to either fill that out or you can disagree with it. I think maybe I've given you a broad stroke of this off air, but we haven't really gone into detail. I would define marriage with 3 P's.
Yes. Preach.
Picture, procreation, partnership. So those 3 P's are coming largely from Genesis 1 to 2, but also then from the fuller picture of the gospel narrative, which we find in places like Ephesians 5, when Christ and the church is described in analogy to the marriage. Yeah. So you have procreation, picture, partnership. We'll start with partnership because that's the most clear. Procreation and partnership are clear early on in Genesis, right? God says the heavens and the earth are good, the sky and the sea are good, the plants and animals are good. Good. The first not good is it's not good that man should be alone. Yeah. And just to rehearse the Genesis story, because it's always good to rehearse the Genesis story, Adam has beast after beast after beast brought to him, and it's still not good. The dog, the cat, the deer.
No cat ladies, no cat men. It's not a biblical
in Genesis.
Thing. Yeah.
The beasts are not sufficient for partnership with Adam. It's not, and so it's not good that he's alone, and he's still alone even if he has beasts in the eyes of God. And so the woman is created. She's called a helper. Helper is not a degrading term. It's a specific term. Yep. It's a term of role.
Of role, not dignity.
But just as God elsewhere is called helper to Israel, the woman is called helper to Adam. Yeah. She fulfills the partnership, and therefore neither now man or woman are alone. So we've got partnership. Yep. I think most people would agree with at least a shallow level of partnership. We're going to go deeper on what partnership actually is, but most people would agree, hey, I don't want to be alone. That's what marriage is I'm picking the person that I want to be with. But marriage is not just a partnership. It's not just inward looking. It involves procreation because those two that are together were said that one of the first commands is to go and multiply. Yeah. Now, importantly, even after the fall, this command is doubled down on
Yep.
with Noah and Abraham.
Yep.
And so even though there's this dramatic rift in human history
Mm-hmm.
between the creation of marriage and the command to multiply,
Mm-hmm.
there's a dramatic rift at the fall. The command is still the same, be fruitful, multiply, which completely counteracts any type of modern notion that we need to stop having kids because the world's just so bad, or
Right.
or any kind of dispensational 1900s notion that the rapture is coming, so we should stop
Just
having
stop it,
kids.
right.
And we should be afraid of climate change and the rapture, and we should stop having kids. No.
Yep.
Even after the most dramatic thing in human history, the fall, be fruitful, multiply, was a command that was still given.
Yep.
And that starts to make marriage look not just inwards, but outwards. Now, we always have to address topics like infertility because we don't want to be insensitive, but I don't think it's insensitive to say that in the normal course of events, most people are able to fulfill that.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Is that-
it's like talking about disability, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have a disability, you should not take offense at the fact that there is something that's considered normal functionality, right? So, for my part, I don't have disability per se, but I have epilepsy. So twice a day, I take medication. That it's not normal. It's not normal for people to do that. My brain does not work normally. I don't like that fact.
It's sorrowful.
Right.
You should lament that.
Yeah, not pleasant. But the reality is, I know that epilepsy is not something that needs to be normalized as a good thing, because it's a reflection of the fall. That something is not good, and so again, I don't like it. But do I begrudge the fact that other people
So essentially,
have brains that are normal?
we lament infertility because it keeps us from what is good and right and true.
Exactly.
And so we should lament because it
Yes.
keeps us from. And this is that you're on a podcast with two guys who have experienced miscarriage loss. So this is not a pain that is unknown to us.
Right.
And the pain there is because it keeps us from
Yes.
doing what God
It's
has
loss.
designed for marriage.
It's
right?
genuine loss, right?
So procreation is necessary, and I think that's so important because oftentimes in modern conversations about things like femininity or womanhood, some type of conservative voice will say, well, a woman is someone who has childbearing capabilities. That's what distinguishes biologically a woman from a man. And usually the response will be, so are you saying that someone who cannot have a child is not a woman?
Right, or an
And
elderly woman or something like that. Or,
And the key is to respond, no, but in normal operation,
right,
women have the ability to bear children.
correct.
Just like in normal operation, human beings have two legs.
Right.
If there is a person with only one leg, we do not say they're unhuman. We just say normally
There's something missing.
humans
Yeah.
have two legs. So we have to maintain procreation. Now, we didn't say what number, we didn't say how many, but we do have to say that part of the marital union is to make more, to be fruitful and multiply.
And it is to be fruitful. It's not to be parsimonious with children.
Define
just to be clear.
parsimonious.
To be cheap. To just say, okay, well, I guess I'll have one kid because I'm supposed to, right? Like procreation, not the act of procreation, but the result of procreation is supposed to be celebrated. And that's a good thing. And God said it is a good thing to do that,
Yeah.
to have children. So
One of the things I'll tell people when they're determining number of kids is, I think it's Psalm 127, children are a heritage from the Lord.
Yep.
And I'll say that whatever number you decide, it needs to be with a heart that says children are a heritage from the
Yes.
Lord. And my wife and I have had legitimate conversations about how many children it's responsible to have as a ministry leader, when I'm devoting time to the church. But we're
Kevin
gonna,
DeYoung will give you an answer.
I know. But the heart has to be children are a gift,
Yeah.
not a hindrance, not an inconvenience. They are a gift of the Lord. Now, this obviously eliminates two major partnerships that are currently considered marriages.
Correct.
Because two men, two women cannot procreate. What would you say then, Chris, to someone who would respond, yeah, but they can adopt?
They can, but we're not talking about adoption. We're talking about procreation.
Okay.
And so, yes, it's true that adoption exists, and adoption is forgive the term because I have very good friends, people in our church that I love, who have adopted, and so that's this term I don't mean to be insulting in any way, but adoption is an accommodation to a flaw. typically speaking. When you're dealing with infertility, when you're dealing with an inability to conceive children, adoption is there to accommodate the fact that something is not functioning the way that it should be. Now, there are some people who adopt and have biological children as well, and but I think that's a separate issue, because the question is right now, like, well, does this negate a marital union because of the inability to do this, and does adoption substitute?
Mm-hmm.
And I think adoption does not substitute, because I'm sure that there are plenty of families who deal with infertility, and they're not thinking, well, isn't infertility great? They're not celebrating infertility. They're not celebrating an inability to conceive children. They're saying, from a Christian context, saying God has withheld this from us in order that adoption might be pursued, because these other children need care in a way that our home can provide every other stable aspect of what a family unit should look like. And the problem within the context of a homosexual relationship or that kind of a thing is that you may be able to adopt, but I would say for the same purpose that a single person adopting is not a healthy situation.
Well, here's the rub. And adoption is not a way to get around God's design by rebelling against him.
Correct.
So adoption is not a safeguard for if you rebel against his design and you still want some of the goods.
Yes.
Adoption is a beautiful means of fulfilling God's design when fulfilling God's design is not worked in a fallen world.
Yeah.
Right? And so adoption is not a gotcha, because that's often what happens here, in the same way that when you talk about what is a woman and someone says, well, are you saying someone who can't have a child is a woman? It's a gotcha card.
Right.
I'm saying in the normal course of operation, this is what the difference between male and female is. And similar, in the normal course of marriage, this is what it's purposed for. And beautifully, we have gospel-centered formula for adoption where we can say...
Yeah, people we love in our church adopted and are wonderful parents as adoptive parents. So it's not bad, but it's not... Yeah.
Basically, I'm fulfilling God's design for marriage, and because I live in a fallen world, my body's been affected in such a way that I can't have a child, but I still want to fulfill God's design for marriage by having a child, and so I adopt. That's a very different thing than I'm rebelling against God's design in marriage, and I still want something I want.
Yeah, I would say another way to kind of, to look at that in terms of the, well, what about adoption for a same-sex couple? This is not meant to be crass, but I think this is an appropriate analogy. When you talk about things like companionship, and there is a sexual aspect to marriage. I mean, there's a reason why, hey, I've got great male friends. You're a great male friend, Josh. I'm not talking about marrying you for several reasons, obviously, but, one, there's a sexual component to it. Now, if somebody were to say, well, hey, you know what? How come my relationship with prostitutes is not, why don't you consider that a marriage relationship? It's because you're missing the point on a lot of other stuff too, and because God has expressly forbade that type of relationship where you are stepping in to indulge yourself in a sinful practice to substitute for what God has declared to be good. And so, is prostitution an acceptable substitute? But guys like, you know what? I find great companionship in the arms of a different prostitute, every other month.
So I'm fulfilling the partnership piece.
Right. And so,
in my eyes,
exactly, and at the same time, then you are both fulfilling something that you could say, okay, well, this is I'm meeting this, but at the same time, you are grossly distorting something as well. And so this is why, I love Ken Ham. I love Answers in Genesis, and he beats the drum over and over again to the point that it's irritating to a lot of people, but it's for good reason that he beats the drum and talking about answers in Genesis, because the most fundamental questions about human existence, all you have to do is look at the first 6 chapters of Genesis, and you see things like human depravity. Why are we the way we are? Human design. How should a human being function? Who is a human being? In the image, all these things are revealed for us right away in the first 6 chapters of Genesis. And so you think, okay, God did not say, Adam, it's not good that you're alone. I'm going to create a series of women for you to experience sexual relationships with in order that you feel fulfilled.
Right.
So, we can't take aspects of marriage then and substitute it and saying, well, though this is absent, I can find a substitute, and then we'll call it good.
Right.
So.
So to summarize, we've talked about partnership. That was clear and easy. God says it's not good for man to be alone, creates woman as helper. And then as we get into procreation, maybe a good summary would be procreation was God's design before the fall, be fruitful, multiply. Procreation is God's design after the fall, be fruitful, multiply. But at the fall, you think about Genesis 3, there will be pain in childbearing, and that means many things. One of them means there will be barrenness. One of them means that the physical act will be painful. So some people even argue so far as Eve losing Abel was part of the pains of childbirth because she gave birth intimately to a child that she lost. And I think a lot of mothers in our church would understand that pain. And so in God's design, be fruitful and multiply is there pre-fall and post-fall.
And companionship for that matter. Because you look at things like the curse, the curse on Eve is you will desire your husband's position. And there will be strife and enmity between you and your husband.
It would be a competition, not a partnership.
Exactly. But it's still enjoined upon humanity, get married, right? So
post-fall, we have our bodies affected physically. You and I we're actually both standing during this podcast. And part of the reason we're both standing during this podcast is because we both have different injuries. And post-fall, our bodies are affected in such a way, and that includes procreation. Adoption, therefore, becomes a means of faithful individuals who are already fulfilling God's design in the partnership, in the picture, male and female, finding another way to fulfill God's design in the procreation. But it is not a get-around if you refuse to fulfill the design in partnership or picture, right? Which brings us to picture.
So what's picture, Josh?
I think this was really helpful for me. I highly recommend, I think it's Kevin DeYoung's book, Men and Women in the Church. I highly recommend that because a lot of the literature on men and women in the church has to do more with the can-nots and the do-nots. I found that to be a problem for me. It's the culture defines masculinity by what you should not do, and sometimes the church can define femininity by what you shouldn't do or cannot do. I think Kevin DeYoung beautifully spends, I think, the first half of the book defining who men and women are first, which is really helpful when he starts to talk about the picture of marriage. And I think this is where Christians have to beat the drum over and over again, is that so-called same-sex marriage or partnership, whatever, does not fulfill the differentiated picture of Christ in the church. What's not clear in Genesis 1-2, but what is clear in the New Testament and what is cloudy but present in the Old Testament is that God's relationship with his people is like a marriage. It's not all over the place in the Old Testament, though it is in places like Hosea, or I think it's Isaiah where he says, for the maker is your husband. So there is language in the Old Testament that leads us to believe that God sees himself in some ways in a husband relationship to a bride. He ends up calling Hosea to faithfulness towards a faithless woman to mimic his faithfulness towards faithless Israel. And then when Christ comes on the scene, he uses analogies of wedding banquets to talk about what it's going to be like when he comes back for his people. He goes to prepare a room for his people, which is analogous to what a husband does during the engagement process in Israel. He goes to prepare a house so that they can move in together. And then Paul explicitly calls Christ the husband and the church his bride. And we see in Revelation, the book we're preaching in our churches, that's the end of all things, is a wedding banquet where the bride, the church, is adorned in white garments, eating at the table with her husband, for the marriage supper of the Lamb has come. So the picture is Christ as husband, church as bride, and that in Ephesians 5 is connected directly to husbands and wives. So to lose the husband-wife differentiation and to have husband-husband or wife-wife is to lose the picture differentiation of Christ.
Well, even as Paul in Ephesians talks about, the marital union, he talks about the relationship between Jesus and the church in a way that he cites from Genesis saying, a man will leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so wrapped up in that definition that Paul gives by appealing to Genesis is to say, you consider what happens in a marriage. A marriage is where a man commits himself to a woman in a way that they become inseparable. And that is again, I'm sure there may be children listening at some point, but biologically, God's design in biology shows that there is a complementary experience that exists between men and women. And so when you look at the relationship between a male and a female and a female, when it comes to a picture, God has designed humanity in many different ways to reflect complementarity. So you see it within biology, you see it within even just personality. And this is not to say, just to be clear, this is not to say that all men function the same way, all women function the same way emotionally. My wife is, I would say, she's definitely less verbal than I am in a lot of ways that people might say, more feminine characteristics. I might display some of those in ways that are more pronounced than my wife. But there is a general design that exists that belongs to men and that belongs to women, and that God has designed men and women to occupy those spaces. And you see it reflected in most world cultures, where you'll see men are charged with protecting women, and that women are generally regarded, and this is politically incorrect to say, but women are, typically speaking, physically weaker than men, and that shows God's design for a man to protect and to provide.
Well, and you were near apologetic for bringing in the sexual differentiation in the marriage union as a picture, but we're almost forced to think of that because many of the other physical manifestations of the differentiation in a modern society aren't there anymore.
Right.
Because we're not in a hunter-gatherer culture. We're not in a warrior culture. We're not in a culture where a lot of these things it would be very clear who you would want to be protecting versus nurturing.
Exactly.
And so in a modern society, everything becomes relativized and subjectivized. And so you are in some ways grasping for pictures and go, what do we point to as an undeniable proof of the differentiation between male and female? And the bedroom is still one of them.
Yes.
And so much so that any reasonable person looking at the union of two men or two women says, that doesn't fit.
Right.
That's not how this is designed.
Yeah.
It's a perversion of what the design is, and then we can go to that extreme example and go back and say, okay, most cultures in human history have agreed to the differentiation.
Right. Now, to be clear, just to kind of give some ground here that needs to be given, to be clear, homosexual behavior has existed in every culture, right? So has murder. Right, so I just want to make this clear here, and is that to say that we're equating murder with homosexual behavior? Well, yes and no, because is it as destructive as murder? No, it's not physically as destructive, but what it is it shows a perversion, right? And so homosexual behavior is like murder in the sense that murder takes God's gift of life and diminishes it to the convenience of an individual to say this person should live or die based on my standard. Homosexual behavior says, you know what, I look at my own conduct, I look at my own sexual conduct, I look at other people, and I say that these people should exist according to my design, for my own pleasure, and so then you twist it and you pervert it. And so, yes, homosexual behavior has existed in every other culture. And certainly, you look at the first century Roman culture, homosexual behavior was all over the place. There's artistic depictions of it and so forth.
Would you say it was accepted? Was it celebrated in the same way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it was celebrated because I don't think that cultural dialogue existed the way then that it does now. But I think if they had the media that we have available to us, I'm sure it would have been, because you can find fresco everywhere, in wealthy, particularly wealthy Roman homes that depicted homosexual behavior, right? And so that happened, and it was, I would suggest, the same reason that Sodom and Gomorrah had their condemnations, because they had become so self-involved and so self-absorbed that they gave themselves over to whatever pleasure. And that's why Romans chapter 1, Paul leads off by talking about homosexual behavior as a display of what happens when people are given over to just a sense of pleasure defined by their own standards instead of recognizing God's design.
When he uses the term worship, they worship the creature rather than the creator.
Yep.
And so I think you look at male-male union or female-female union, and you say, well, it removes the gospel picture, so it's no longer a representation of Christ and the church, God and his people. So it's not about God anymore. It removes the procreative element. And so then it's not about giving life. It's not about fostering community. It's not about looking outwardly and saying, hey, there's a stability that comes with marriage and a procreation that's good for society. So it's really only about inward looking. And I think that's where you take the threefold distinction of procreation, partnership, and picture, and you eliminate, and then you get a shallow version of partnership where partnership only means not alone. Now, biblically, partnership is more than that. Marriage becomes one of the greatest strengthening and refining relationships in your life. And marriage, husbands, with all the things husbands are called to do, husbands are called to present their brides blameless, right? And so there's a great part of the marriage relationship that has to do with sanctification and refining. And so then even the partnership piece is not just fulfillment. There are many times where my wife and I are not immediately fulfilled in our relationship because we have to refine one another. Right? But if marriage is only defined as a shallow partnership that's a consumer good to make me satisfied, then even half of the partnership relationship is gone. So now we don't have one of three, we have half of one of three. And so we've really dwindled down a full orbed view of marriage. Okay, so that was quite a bit of time on really, I guess, the perversion of those three things. Not perversion. I guess that's not fair because we defined each. I guess what I'm trying to get here, Chris, is how do we go from that threefold definition to helpful thoughts for the church in regards to this relationship of marriage?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, just looking at our time right now, I think this is helpful for us as a bridge between what we've talked about with the Pride Month wrap up and all that kind of stuff, and what we do talk about relationally. So I'm completely good with spending more time on this issue going forward because we want to give a positive picture. But I think the reason why we do spend time talking about what we've just spent a chunk talking about is that we live in a culture that has so, again, I just go back to my childhood experience. I had no problem understanding the place of marriage as God designed, because I grew up in a home where that was just understood. There was an objective category to understand. And at no point was it ever even in my mind to think, okay, well, if my parents aren't feeling satisfied, they'll just get a divorce, right? Now, that is common. It's like 3 years in, 5 years in, I'm just not feeling it anymore. And it's like, okay, well, what's your option? We get a divorce. That's okay. Right, so I think we've shifted so dramatically within our culture to a spot where we fundamentally believe that the marriage relationship is designed for only the purpose of personal fulfillment, that we do need to define against something. And we need to define against what we currently accept. And by accept, I truly mean accept. We accept as the way that one ought to do something, that marriage ought to be pursued like this. It was funny, I went to, when my wife and I were first dating, this was a long time ago. When we were first dating, we went to a wedding of one of my wife's cousin. And we went to this wedding, and it was in we call a liberal mainline church. And as the pastor, I guess we'll call him a pastor, opened up his sermonette during the wedding ceremony. This is what he opened with. He said, a lot of people think that the Bible says a lot about marriage, but it doesn't.
Woof.
Yeah. Woof.com. I mean, that's woof.com level. And
isn't the job of a pastor to say, the Bible actually says more about this than you thought it did, not less than you thought it did.
Exactly. In fact, I mean, the entire Bible speaks to the marriage supper of the Lamb.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's no shortage at any point of being able to point to the picture of marriage. But what that reflects to me is I think, okay, even within a church context where you have somebody who has diminished the view of Scripture, because that particular tradition and that individual accepted a view of Scripture that was subservient to humanity, as though somehow we could make of the Bible what we wanted. He made this statement, and it just you remember the RCA dog, those ads, like a little white and black dog, and he cocked his head like this.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, that's basically what I did as like a 21-year-old. I'm like, huh? Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is insane. No, wait a second. No, I was 20. What was it? 23. I just turned 23.
Okay.
A little bit older than 21. But I'm just like, this is nuts. What is this guy talking about? But you know what? Seeing the fruit of this years later, it's like, yeah, that is the way people view it. That is the way people treat it. So, you know, I think that it's right for us to just acknowledge the fact that this is the reality we live in. We do live in this reality. And so the biblical picture of marriage is truly countercultural. I think it warrants another conversation. So
You'll like this, Chris. I think my wife has she calls them farticles. They're fake articles. So farticles for my wife are things that she feels passionately about, but doesn't have anyone to say it to, so she'll write half an article, and it's just hidden away. And one of the articles I think she has cropped up is how to respond when someone says the Bible doesn't really say much about.
Nice.
Because it's just a bad argument. It's like the Bible doesn't really say much about parenting. Well, okay, one, it's an entire book about a story of a father and sending his son in order to adopt other sons, in order to instruct them in right living and bring them home to eternity. I mean, and everyone's favorite picture of the gospel
really say anything.
is the prodigal son coming back home. And the book of Proverbs, and you're like, okay, be wary when someone says the Bible doesn't say much about unless it's dinosaurs. Because then, you know, they're right.
Doesn't say a lot about badgers.
Yeah. But that's an argument common. The Bible doesn't say the Bible doesn't say that much about homosexuality. It's like, well, the Bible doesn't say as much as a lot of modern news outlets say about homosexuality, but that's largely because it was agreed upon in Jewish culture that
it ain't
this is
good.
a bad idea.
Yeah.
So Leviticus 18 was enough, and then Jesus doubling down on it by doubling down on creation's order, that was enough for everyone to go, oh, you're right, that's still not good.
And it's not simply because it was a negative command. It's because they understood the positive command. Right. They understood the first words of Genesis were not to be taken figuratively. It wasn't to be taken as a symbol. It was to be taken as be fruitful, multiply, get a wife, have sex, have kids, enjoy that relationship in a way that glorifies God. It's like, well, that's enough, right? I mean, God gave me a clear instruction. It's just like, you know, the other day I was talking with somebody, and we were talking about you know, a professor of gender studies, and somebody taking a gender studies class, and you know, what are different. I'm like, you know what, that class would be about 10 minutes long.
Right.
The 10-minute long class is there are boys, there are girls. Take a look at your plumbing, figure it out, have a good semester.
But people would differentiate between sex and gender there.
Right.
And I mean, I had a conversation with a brother in Christ about that differentiation, and I think what my response to that was, where does design fit into the differentiation between sex and gender? Because what happens, generally speaking, is someone says, well, there's a difference between sex and gender, and let's relativize everything about gender to only being a social construct, which then almost necessarily relativizes sex. But when we have this idea of design, design is more than even a bridge between the two. Sure, girls with pink, boys with blue is a socially constructed piece of gender ideology, but we can't take that extreme and then flip over the design that there's a fixed.
Right.
One thing I'll say before we go, Chris, is we've kind of punched against self-fulfillment this whole time, right? Marriage is not only about self-fulfillment. Marriage is about many things, not just self-fulfillment. And I guess I want to say the reason we have to do that is because people are saying marriage is essentially only about self-fulfillment. So we're acting against an idea. Secondly, I do want to say that in God's goodness, oftentimes when we pursue a good, not first and foremost for our own fulfillment, we do get fulfillment. Right? So I think about the corporate worship service. The corporate worship service is not for my fulfillment. The corporate worship service is Revelation 4 and 5. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive all blessing and honor and glory and power forever and ever. Amen.
It just so happens that
I get a lot of fulfillment in doing that. Right? And so in the Christian life, oftentimes what I fear someone might go is, guy said I'm just supposed to be miserable in my marriage because it's not about No. What happens is when we lift our eyes off of ourselves and onto the Lord and onto others, we find ourselves getting fulfilled. because we weren't made to just be inward looking all the time,
Right.
worried about our own self-satisfaction. Man, the most crippled I can be on a Sunday is when I go home thinking, am I okay? Did I do enough? Do people like me? The most fulfilled I ever am on a Sunday afternoon is when I'm not thinking
You're
about myself
self-forgetful.
at
Yep.
all.
Absolutely.
And so that comes home in marriage as well, where it's when we get our eyes off ourself and our self-satisfaction, our self-fulfillment. Maybe it's onto the family unit. Maybe it's onto serving and loving one another in the marriage. Maybe it's on to saying, hey, even in a hard season of marriage, I'm still picturing God's faithfulness as a husband to me, as a
Yes.
bride. We get our eyes on there, and then we'll find ourselves finding fulfillment in the worldly good that we're enjoying.
Yeah. And I would say this ultimately, to know the pleasure of God. To know the pleasure of God.
Give me more than that.
To know that you are doing what is pleasing in God's sight, even if it doesn't feel good.
Oh man, we need a recapturing of that in the modern day. So thanks for taking some time to think. We are going to pause the marriage conversation here. We'll do marriage round 2 next time on the podcast and talk a little bit more about the particulars of marriages within the church, marriage as a good to the church, how we can support one another in our marriages. We'll talk about that next time on A Time to Think.